Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and today we're going to talk about the top 10 changes in DC Rebirth. So we're nearing the 2-year anniversary of DC's Rebirth line. On the whole, I've really enjoyed the changes that DC Rebirth has come to represent to their comic book line. It's been a marked improvement in the overall quality of the comics, and there's been a lot of positive changes that have led me to really start enjoying DC Comics again on a level that just wasn't there in the New 52. So today we're going to go over my favorite changes. It's an interesting mix of in-canon changes to the overall continuity of DC, and a lot of significant work behind the scenes that has led to an improvement in the overall climate of the company. We're going to go over both because I find that both had a strong influence on why I started liking DC's Rebirth again. It'll also be a good opportunity for some of you out there who aren't totally familiar with DC's Rebirth line to get a sense of what these changes are and what this means to the company. Hopefully it'll create an easier climate for new readers to start reading DC's Rebirth comics because frankly they're awesome, and the cool part about them is that once you have a general sense of what's going on, you can pretty much pick up any series from any point and start reading. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as I go over the all-time greatest changes that have happened in DC's Rebirth so far. Number 10. The Legion and the Society. First up is a relatively simple change that happened within DC's line, and that's the return of the Legion of Superheroes and the Justice Society of America. Of course, part of the reason why this is at the very bottom of the list is that this isn't actually much of a change at all, in that it's something that's been hinted at heavily but hasn't quite happened yet. Nevertheless, the loss of the Justice Society and the Legion of Superheroes was something really felt in the era of New 52. It was a step away from DC's legacy and everything that made them great in the past, so for these characters to be slowly bleeding in is a good thing for the company as a whole. I also approve of the way they're going about it, rather than rushing these two teams out of the gate and bringing them into the world of DC immediately at the launch of Rebirth, when everything was changing already and the fans had to already adjust to a great deal of shifts in how DC was producing comics. The Legion and the Society was something that could wait, and is something they can focus on going forward. It seems intimately tied into the greater narrative of stuff going on within DC's Rebirth, and that's fun too, since it puts it front and center and will inevitably become the focus of the story at some point or another. How exactly this is all going to happen is currently unknown, but whatever they have planned seems good, and the return of these characters is always a good thing. It'll be nice to have characters like Jay Garrick returning into the fold, along with other heroes along the lines of Alan Scott and classic heroes like Hawkman or whatever else they have planned for the Justice Society. Whatever the case, it's a fun time to be a fan of DC as these old characters are returning, and it's emblematic of something that Rebirth does as a whole, bringing back older characters and ideas and presenting them in fun and new ways. This is something DC has done for a long time and is nothing new, but the return of characters like these is an important aspect of DC's Rebirth, bringing back these things that the New 52 had effectively abandoned. And that's great. It's nice to have this all coming back, and I'm looking forward to more of that in the future. Right now, the Legion of Superheroes seems intimately tied into the business surrounding Doomsday Clock, so we'll see how that goes, yet I'm quite excited to see what exactly DC has planned in this regard. Number 9. Mr. Oz and the Watchmen. Another important aspect of DC's Rebirth, in fact the biggest change and important thing worth knowing about this shift in canon that's happened, is the appearance of characters from the original Watchmen story, as well as the mysterious Mr. Oz, who worked behind the scenes throughout a lot of events surrounding the first year and a half of DC's Rebirth. Eventually it was revealed that Mr. Oz was Jor-El, who survived the events of Krypton's destruction and has been working for his own mysterious purposes, gathering the likes of Tim Drake and other heroes while influencing the life of Superman before ultimately confronting that hero and disappearing once more. Whatever is going on with Jor-El and these Watchmen characters, it's a very interesting mystery that Rebirth has crafted slowly over the last 2 years. They've done a good job at keeping this mystery mysterious and us not knowing exactly where things are going. And I have to say, on the whole, it's worked really well. This is kind of near the bottom of the list because I'm not exactly sure where DC is going with all of this stuff, And as much as I've enjoyed the slow cookie crumb of hints that Rebirth had released since the launch of this new series of comics. As we've gotten into Doomsday Clock, I've gotten a little more ambivalent towards all of this content. It's not bad, but it definitely doesn't live up to the writings of Alan Moore, and Geoff Johns in particular seems like an ill-suited writer for covering this kind of content. He's just not the kind of man who can follow up on Alan Moore's writing in an adequate way. In fact, he's one of the worst writers to do something like that. Geoff Johns is good at big and broad stories that don't have a ton of depth to them, but are heavy on fun. Alan Moore is only depth, so it's a bit of a mishmash, and that's part of the problem of adapting characters from a classic story like The Watchmen. Nevertheless, it's a fun and positive change for the canon, and it's an interesting direction for the series to take. On the whole, I definitely approve in that it's something different and new, and I genuinely have no idea where they're going with these characters and ideas. We'll probably get some more hints in Doomsday Clock, but as that series is unraveling, I'm getting the impression that's not the end-all and be-all of Rebirth, which is actually another strength of this publishing line. They aren't rushing out of the gate to get to any of their crazy ideas or anything like that. They're invested in this and in taking their time with it. We'll talk more about that later, but suffice to say it's definitely a positive aspect of DC overall. Number 8. Good planning with confidence. So speaking of that slow burn I was talking about, this is a good example of DC doing a great job with their planning and how they execute some of their ideas. DC has had no shortage of controversial ideas, from bringing back The Watchmen to publishing their comics every 2 weeks, as well as shortening the overall length of the average story arc in each series. Most of them are being only about 2 issues long these days. Yet when the story calls for it being longer, it's longer. When the story calls for a big crossover, they go for that too. It seems that creativity comes first these days, but more importantly, when these plans are set, DC sticks to them, they don't apologize for them, and they don't hand-wring over the changes and meet people halfway for fear of what fans might say. They stick with the plan, and not only that, but it's a good plan, and that makes a big difference. DC had similar confidence when it came to the New 52, sort of, but they'd often do half measures and walk things back once they got backlash. They haven't done that as much in Rebirth, in part because a lot of their ideas in terms of the raw quality of the idea as a whole has improved significantly. And that's a good thing. It means that we're actually having an editorial oversight going on, and one that's positive for the comic book community and the quality of these comics as a whole. It's a strong sense of improvement, which is pretty much what they've done across the board as we're talking about these things throughout this top 10. Nevertheless, it's a strong sign of strong management, and that's particularly impressive because the people at the top of DC didn't really change so much as it appears their attitudes did and how they go about these things. Say what you will about them bringing back the Watchmen characters and all that stuff, at least they did so with confidence and with good planning along with good ideas, all of which made for a fun experience overall in these first 2 years of Rebirth. Number 7. Aesthetics. So this one's going to be a bit weird in that it's not necessarily going to be something everyone's going to agree on. Art, after all, is super subjective, and not everyone is going to have the same inklings as I do. However, I feel the overall quality of art has greatly improved from the days of the New 52 to the current art that we experience in the average Rebirth comic. This obviously isn't a universal trend. There's going to be some New 52 comics that look way better than the stuff being published in the era of Rebirth, but the way that Rebirth is publishing comics does seem to have led to a systematic improvement in the quality of art coming out from each individual inker, artist, and colorist. Although it does lose the consistency of having a team of artists paired with a certain writer throughout an entire run of a series, instead the artists get time to work on each of their projects, and enough time that they actually can put in a lot of work and love. I'm sure the comics of DC's Rebirth line operate under a similar metric of deadlines and that sort of thing. These deadlines seem to be looser thanks to this rotating team of artists, and as such, the quality of art has greatly improved from everyone. We could do a huge long montage of all the crazy artwork that I've seen coming out of Action Comics, Superman, Greg Capullo from his time with All-Star Batman and DC Metal, and pretty much every colorist from Doom Patrol to Again, Action Comics comes to mind for solid coloring work. Batman has great artists and colorists attached to it right now, as does Detective Comics. The list goes on and on until I pretty much would have to reference every single series published under Rebirth. Not only that, but people like Mitch Gerads are doing super creative stuff with Mr. Miracle, let alone truly creative stuff that comes out of DC every once in a while, like the Karwandi Challenge, which had a lot of creativity in both its writing and artistic side. Number 6. Inclusivity without exclusivity. Now hear me out, because I'm sure people are already rushing to the comment section to whine and complain about diversity and what I'm talking about here, but I'm actually speaking a bit more broadly than just the simple demographics that you might be expecting here. DC Rebirth has had a real focus on including a lot of different walks of life into their world of comics. Not only does this include visible minorities, women, and those of the LGBTQ community, this is also expanded into the likes of people of different political orientations, families, people who are young and single. There was a time when superhero comics really wouldn't focus on the wide world of human life, but increasingly DC Rebirth is showing us lots of different heroes in lots of different settings. So Superman and Batman are family men now, who have robust families, and they're growing as we speak. Meanwhile, we have a focus on new heroes who are gradually taking over series and titles without it being at the cost of past heroes and the legacy that they created. Perhaps the best example of this is in the Green Lantern comics, where Jessica Cruz and Simon Baz are currently Green Lanterns in training, who operate largely around Earth and the Justice League, while Hal Jordan and the older Green Lanterns currently work to lead the larger organization out in space. Stuff like that goes a long way to making DC feel welcome to new readers and old, and something that Marvel could learn a lot from. So DC Comics are pretty much more diverse than they've ever been, but they didn't do it at the expense of older characters. They didn't do the Marvel route and kill off half their cast just to bring in these new characters, and as such, the climate's a lot more positive. Look, for all the complaining and labeling critics of Marvel get, the fact of the matter is, a lot of these people aren't voicing the same objections over at DC, even though both companies are about as diverse as each other at this point. And that really says a lot about how DC has handled this content versus Marvel, and the differences have really come into focus during DC's Rebirth line. Perhaps my favorite aspect of this is that DC has kind of gotten less uncomfortable with assigning talent to content that doesn't necessarily match their demographics. There was a time, and it wasn't that long ago, where if you were a black man, odds are you would be assigned to write for a black character or a team that only really features black characters. They were getting really stereotypical about this stuff, and that's part of the reason why Christopher Priest agreed to return to DC, because they came to him not with an offer to work for Cyborg or some other character like that, but for Deathstroke, and later the Justice League. He wanted to write for characters that didn't look exactly like him, and he should be able to, just as white writers should have every right to create content for characters who don't resemble them, no matter what their demographics are. And that's a good thing, and a positive direction for the company as a whole. It's also a more welcoming company to work at now that people like Eddie Brazonga no longer work there, and DC has made their workplace a much more safer and happier environment on the whole, which is a good thing. So overall, it's a better company inside and out because of all this stuff, and I really appreciate them for doing that. Number 5. The return of Wally West. So after some behind the scenes changes, it's worth noting that some stuff did change in canon that really did matter. And one of the most important things was the return of Wally West, who was effectively erased as part of the New 52 and recreated into pretty much an entirely new character that only as of the start of Rebirth had just gotten his powers as Kid Flash. Bringing back the original Wally West, who worked as the Flash for decades and pretty much is the one true Flash to a lot of fans, was a good move, since a lot of people were upset with him going. It was a signal that not only could DC bring these characters back, but do it in a way that didn't create bad blood with the fan base and still kept the New 52 version of the Wally West around. There's so many great aspects of this, it really can't be understated. Not only does this keep a version of Wally West that resembles the CW verse around, but it gives an interesting dynamic between an older, experienced Wally West and a new one just starting out in his career. both of whom are doing really well as characters in their respective titles. It adds to the greater mystery of DC's Rebirth while also bringing a beloved character back, and it's really hard to object to any of that, and represents one of the most positive changes that happened as a result of Rebirth. It was a hell of a moving moment when the Flash finally got to remember his old sidekick and companion and gave Wally a big hug in DC's first Rebirth comic. Ever since then, it's been a moving experience to have him back and working with the Titans and finding his place in this new world that he doesn't necessarily fit in. It's a good story and part of the many great changes that DC's Rebirth brought, all of which had a lot of respect for the past and legacy of DC's canon before the New 52. Number 4. The Return of Superman. Right along the lines of Wally West coming back is the idea of Superman coming back and it being an overall positive change for the world of Rebirth. With Superman's return came the original Lois Lane as well, and along with them came a new child, all of whom have proven to be solid additions to the overall canon of DC. They were sorely missed, and it represented a really strong direction forward for Superman, to the extent that if they ever backtracked on this and made Superman single and we had to go through all this courtship with Lois Lane and that business again, I'd be really, really bored with the entire prospect. That sounds like something I've read 100 times over. This stuff with Rebirth and Superman having a son and a family he cares about, it's all new, and all of it is so great and so fun because of it. Seeing little John grow up with Superman and giving him advice, him learning from Lois as well, and finding friends in Damian Wayne and other members of the Teen Titans has been a really positive experience and one of the strongest aspects of DC's canon as a whole. If you haven't read the Superman comics out of Rebirth, you're missing out because it was honestly one of the best runs we had up until the time of Bendis. And I'm not saying Bendis is bad, it just hasn't come out yet and I don't know where things are going from here, but I don't care because this year and a half has been great and I wouldn't trade that experience for anything else. Superman's return has meant more than just this family dynamic, although that is really strong. He also remembers everything that happened on the original New Earth, and as such it colors his experiences, from how he deals with the Trinity to how he deals with Lex Luthor and thinks about that character who originally was trying to be a hero when this Superman returned. It's been a good story overall and a really strong aspect of Rebirth's canon, one that I consider perhaps the most important point. How all of this plays into the greater narrative of Rebirth, we'll see, but it seems like Superman is front and center with whatever's going on with Dr. Manhattan. So bringing back a Superman character that remembers his death at the hands of Doomsday and all these other important in-canon events from pre-New 52 time is great and has meant a really positive change overall to DC. Number 3. The multiverse expands. There was a time when DC was effectively afraid of the multiverse and really only wanted to have one in-canon version of Earth. Those days are long behind us, as the New 52 not only gave us 52 worlds, but at the end of DC Metal, the source wall was destroyed, and as such there's no limit to the number of worlds out there. We are finally back to a DC canon with infinite worlds. And that is so critically important, I can't believe it took them this long to get us back around to this status quo. The reason for that is it represents the ultimate freedom for writers to do new things, to create new characters, to tell new stories, especially in the wonderful world of Elseworld comics. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they have planned in terms of the multiverse because it no longer restricts the writers the way even 52 Worlds did. Now you have any number of Superman or Batman that can show up, new continuities and canons, new ideas. The next Red Sun story is just around the corner now and could happen anytime because there's no limit to the number of worlds they can create. And that is wonderful. It's the best aspect of DC's Rebirth and was something they were hinting at since the launch of Rebirth but was really cemented as part of DC Metal. It's really one of the most positive changes overall and one of the most important aspects of DC Rebirth to me. Number 2, behind the scenes. So I've mentioned how they're planning and certain little behaviors behind the scenes has really meant a positive improvement overall for the world of these comics. But there's even more than that going on behind the scenes. Like I said, the 2-week publishing schedule has really meant a positive change overall to the art quality of the comics, but I feel it's represented a better publishing schedule on the whole. It goes a mile a minute now, but it means that DC is also able to pack a lot of continuity in. We're already nearing the 52-issue milestone for a lot of the mainstream DC Rebirth comics, and that's crazy because it literally happened within half the time of the New 52. The nice thing about that is that the writers are able to pack in a lot of stories, including a lot of great ideas for stories that I think have come to place because overall the editorial nature going on behind the scenes of DC's comics has greatly improved. Like I said, nobody was really fired and there hasn't been a major shift in leadership as far as I can tell within DC's Rebirth, but there was definitely a strong attitude adjustment. How DC deals with its fans, how they deal with their own employees and their employees' ideas has markedly improved across the board. This suggests to me that someone, somewhere, sat down, listed all the major complaints people had with the New 52, and went out and specifically addressed them, because across the board, we've seen improvements in how they deal with sexual abusers within their own company, in how they deal with conflicts with the creators and editors, and how they deal with being afraid of doing new things with their characters. All of this has gotten a lot better. Now they're more willing to acknowledge that there needs to be character development and changes within the canon. And they aren't trying pathetically to make you like their comics. Instead, they're making stuff that sound creative and fun. So we get to have a crossover with Hanna-Barbera and DC Comics, and some of those comics end up being the best comics published last year. That's the sort of thing that would have never happened under the New 52, which constantly tried to be the coolest person in the room and failed utterly because of such attempts. Let alone the amount of bad blood that had been brewing in the company thanks to changes made to characters like Amanda Waller, Stephanie Brown, and Cassandra Cain, all of which improved, and these characters have returned to the form and versions of them that we like. Where the New 52 made their world of DC much more boring and less fun, everything about Rebirth has made it more vibrant, accessible, interesting, and bigger. The world of Rebirth is a much more bigger and complex world than the one of the New 52, which was insular and circular. It got much more dry compared to the comics of Rebirth, which got way more interesting, way more quickly, thanks to these subtle changes going on in how DC operates as a company. This is really where they've improved the most, is behind the scenes, and why DC's comics have improved so much without really major changes going on within continuity. That's why there have been changes within Rebirth I didn't really get into here. The return of characters like the Batgirls and versions of characters like Amanda Waller, as well as changes like Wonder Woman getting a brother, don't feel like major changes per se, but represented together, they are something that represents a serious improvement and shift towards content that the fans want, which is really good and something that the New 52 is shockingly lacking. It's amazing to think about how bad things were back in the New 52 versus now. There was a time where DC would do something stupid every few months with such regularity that websites like The Outhousers had a counter for them. I think they still have that counter up, but it doesn't feel as appropriate anymore because honestly, these days it's the exact opposite, and every few months DC comes out with some new crazy idea that I ultimately just have to give them the benefit of the doubt over because they've proven themselves time and time again, and every idea they have seems to be a good one. The choice for having more publishing lines, including stuff specifically created for all ages, is a really good one and shows that even going forward there's a lot of great ideas on the table when it comes to DC. And the number one change in Rebirth is the return of love and legacy. This might sound a bit cheesy, but this is by far the most important thing that has happened in the world of DC. No longer do we have to live in the days where New 52 comics were stagnant, everyone was single and unmarried, and there was hardly a speck of love throughout the entire franchise. Now every single Rebirth title has a lot of love and respect for the legacy of these comics ingrained in them. Characters are allowed to get married again, which was something DC was afraid of for some reason during the era of New 52. We're allowed to have characters have a family, and most importantly, this has happened to both Batman and Superman, the two biggest characters in all of DC. Whatever change happened within this company, they clearly have started to actually care about these characters once more in a way that it just didn't seem like they did during the New 52. So we have a genuine sense of love for not only these characters, but on the pages of the comics too. Characters are allowed to love each other again, and to show affection for one another in a way that just wasn't done before. Instead, it was just gross sex scenes or no romantic relationships whatsoever. We were left with these extremes that just didn't work. Now we have characters that are in happy relationships together. We have characters that are single, that sleep around. We have characters that are free to do whatever they want, basically, because there isn't some weird rules going on behind the scenes anymore. Meanwhile, through the return of characters like Stephanie Brown, Cassandra Cain, Wally West, and Superman, we have a genuine respect for the continuity and canon that DC's legacy represents. As we start to hit milestones where Superman and Batman hit their 75th and 80th anniversaries, it's important that we look back on these comics and their legacy, and DC's done a really good job of that thus far. Recently they had Action Comics number 1000, and while I had a few issues with the comic overall, it was a very well done issue on the whole, and one of the top selling comics ever. If nothing else, this is what matters. It makes me want to keep reading these comics. It makes me like reading these comics in a way that just wasn't there in the New 52. The fact that this is a change and something that they weren't doing during the New 52 really speaks to that era of the comics and where it was lacking in most. But to be honest, this was a problem that I identified before Rebirth even started. And it's really nice to see that they actually managed to improve this in significant and meaningful ways. In fact, it's wonderful. It's the best aspect of Rebirth, and that's why it's here at number 1. So that's the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching, and let me know what you thought of my top 10 Rebirth changes in the comments section below. Thanks again for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our Patreon page in the video description. Finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.